you. Thank you all. Thank you very much for that kind introduction. Thank you, Love and Fidelity Network. Thank you, Princeton. I'll just jump right in. Is everything okay with this audio? Okay. I just thought I heard some backdrop noise. So, I'm happy that my kids put stickers all over it, but it's not here today. So it's all right in front of me, but nobody else has to see that. So I'm here to talk today about a topic that is probably very close to home for a lot of you, in that many of you go to college. And the talk today is about breaking the campus bubble, Me Too, and sexual assault. And the obvious thing we know today, all of us who are here, are aware that we have a cultural problem when it comes to sexual assault. We have a problem, is no question. Thanks to the Me Too movement, grave problems like these kept long under wraps are coming to light. At the same time, today, we are hearing stories that suggest a dark side to the hookup culture, not just sexual assault, but hookup culture in general, and looking into blurring lines there. Even when encounters don't necessarily cross boundaries of consent, research shows hookups are not benefiting women as much as popular culture suggests. From the growing body of research on sex regret to internet porn normalizing aggressive, male-centric sex, our current sexual crisis seems to be suggesting consent alone is insufficient protection from sexual injury and exploitation. There's a dark side to the hookup culture that we don't see, we don't hear very often. If you stand up for the Me Too movement, though, I would submit today, there's diminishing room for defense of the hookup culture, where women and men use each other, the lines of consent are increasingly blurred, and there's an increase in sex regret. And I'll talk a little bit more and just define that term of sex regret in a little bit. But let's start where the Me Too movement first started its connection. One of the moments in our cultural conversation in the past year in which Me Too and the hookup culture intersected. And that is the conversation about that website article at Babe with a woman named Grace who accused actor Aziz Ansari of sexual assault. And she cited a rushed and uncomfortable sexual encounter that ended up leaving her in disappointment. By all accounts, after her published article, many people criticized it and said that was not describing a sexual assault. By all accounts but hers, it wasn't definitively a sexual assault legally. So many commentators have since defended Aziz Ansari, saying he's guilty of nothing but an unsatisfying encounter. While it's true that no explicit violation of consent took place in the story that she published, many still view it as painting an ugly picture of what sexual encounters have become for participants today in the hookup culture. And so at least it woke up a lot of people to realizing we have a larger problem than simply consent when it comes to sex today. As a feminist writer, Jessica Valenti, put it on Twitter, a lot of men will read that post about Aziz Ansari and see an everyday, reasonable sexual interaction. But part of what women are saying right now is that what the culture considers normal sexual encounters are not working for us and are oftentimes harmful. Even when they don't necessarily cross the boundaries of consent, it would appear women are not enjoying the results of the sexual revolution very much. And I'm sure Mary Everstadt went into that beautifully yesterday. I'm not just saying this from the Babe published anecdote that women are disappointed, but for years, tons of research have revealed that women are not benefiting as much as the popular culture suggests. For one, sex regret is a growing phenomenon. It may not be technically sexual assault, but it's another important component of our cultural sexual crisis that seems to be begging for attention. In a study completed by the Norwegian University of Science and Technology and the University of Texas at Austin, researchers found the largest factor in predicting sex regret was whether or not they were male or female. Women reported greater instances of regret from partaking in a sexual encounter. Was whether they were male or female. It was not other factors. It was simply whether they were male or female. And women showed that there was a greater instance of sex regret, whereas men were more likely to regret something if they passed up a sexual encounter. Women more so if they actually partook in it. And one of those professors there, Professor Kanner of that Norwegian university, said, well, we're not saying that there aren't men who regret casual sex, but it's far more common for women to regret saying yes. They're also less unequivocally happy about the experience. And not surprisingly, what the researchers found is that alcohol played a large role in this. A 2012 study showed that both men and women who hooked up in the last year were more likely to have been drinking than when they met their partners the night of the hookup. And the same study found that females who were drinking beforehand were more likely to feel discontent with their hookup decisions. But how do we reconcile this sex regret talk of people after the fact regretting an encounter with this actions of women today, which can appear to be very sexually aggressive at times? I've heard this a lot in the comments to articles I've written. Men say, but how are women really hurting so much if they're the ones instigating, not all the time, but if sometimes women are instigating sexual scenarios? And one woman, a friend of mine, said recently, girls more so than guys are the ones being sexually aggressive these days. Now, for a moment, I say, whoa. You know, a lot of the research we see is actually the other way around. But let's talk about this. Let's talk about the Sex and the City image of women starting sexual encounters, because this does happen. My friend in question suggested that the impetus of casual sex today is more so caused by women, and that's a good thing. Where men have perhaps always felt free to approach sex openly, women are now writing their own sexual narratives. And in this context, it seems that there's some progress from that perspective. More sex with less consequence, and it's a good thing. But I'm not so sure. Not that women can do this, of course they can, but what brings me pause is the part about it being an expression that it's coming from women. The way I see it, sexually aggressive behavior in women is more about pleasing men than about empowering women. And when I see women being aggressive, as my friend puts it, I can't help but wonder, are these women acting from their own desires or trying to beat men to the punch of activity that they think is just a part of normal culture, a necessary thing to get to any romance at all? In other words, I'm wondering, have women learned to play the lead in a man-made sexual script in order to avoid succumbing to it? It's sort of a reversal of, am I being acted upon or am I acting out? There are many possible exceptions, of course, but looking at the trends in research about male-female differences, it seems much more likely that this is the case, that women are doing what they think is desired of them, rather than it being their deepest desire to have the frequent no strings attached, often anonymous sex we see in the hookup culture. And we do see this in the dating economics. Evolution theory tells us women generally seek long-term relationship security in a mate, but that might be harder to come by thanks to reports last year showing not only is there a male shortage in most of the Western world, but there's also an eligible male shortage, as John Berger revealed in his 2015 book, Datanomics. Among those with college degrees, there are 4 college-educated women to every 3 college-educated man. Because studies show women want to couple with men on an equal education level as them, the man shortage is a real phenomenon, at least on the post-collegiate level. To me, this is where the idea of a sexual shift among women, where it might come into play. Because the male market is saturated, I think women now feel compelled to compete to stand out. In many ways, metaphorically speaking, women are chasing men today more than men are chasing women. In the short term, the surest way to a men's attention is through sex appeal. And, you know, the way they do in Sex and the City and all sorts of TV shows and everything that we consume today. And I'm actually dating myself by saying Sex and the City. Obviously, there's everything. In a study where men and women are propositioned for no strings attached sex on campus by an attractive number of the opposite sex, many of you have heard this stat, 100% of female participants declined the offer, and about 75% of men were eager to accept. So women were clearly pickier in their sexual partners and experiences. Which is why I think it's a mistake to view a culture of sexually aggressive females as being a good thing for women. It could clearly just as easily speak more to an attempt to being viewed as valuable in relationships that women they want to be viewed as valuable. They want to be viewed as someone who you could have a relationship with. Then it is reflective of their inner yearnings. Women sometimes think sexual promiscuity up front will garner them the long-term commitment they want. But what about all the hardship that they face along the way? And I bring this up, and I'll keep getting back to it, because I do think that Aziz Ansari's story, it showed a woman who was putting up with things that she wasn't comfortable with, but she put up with it for a purpose. She thought it would lead somewhere. So I want us to keep that in the back of our mind. It's not actually it's not delivering on something the participants expect, and maybe even not delivering on something the men expect. Studies have indicated the majority of women don't experience as much physical pleasure in hookup sex as men. And that's no surprise to many. And, I think there was a 40% of women had pleasure during their last hookup, according to a study involving 24,000 college students. Meanwhile, 80% of men did. It's a low number, though, even for 80%. Physical pleasure or not, though, surveys show that women continue to have hookup sex even if they don't enjoy it. They resort to liquid courage if necessary. According to a study of college women's drinking patterns, 89% of those who had hookups with a random stranger involved drinking, and a notable 63% involved 4 or more drinks. And another study found that of female students who did hook up, more than a third reported they would likely not have engaged in the level of sexual activity they did if they had not been drinking. And it seems to me that if many women aren't experiencing pleasure during hookup sex but keep doing it, then they're doing it for some other reason than to feel empowered. Before we rush to teach women, a lot of media at this point, a lot of women's media in particular, rushes to say, okay, let's teach women how to have pleasure in the bedroom. Then we'll all be on the equal playing field. I don't think that's actually the answer that will solve the problem we have here. What we're looking for is what is causing, if it's not an enjoyable experience, what is causing them to get into the bedroom and do that behavior? What is causing them to keep on participating in it? Let's look into that area and try to find some answers. What are women seeking, and what's the best route to achieve it? Can women beat men at their own game in the hookup game? Sure, I have no doubt. But the question we have to ask ourselves is, do we want to, and is it what we actually find fulfilling? From all the narratives we're reading now of people starting to speak honestly about the hookup culture, from the woman Grace in the Babe article, it seems as if the answer is not, that is not answering, that is not fulfilling, no, that is not helping them achieve their goals. As a high school senior interviewed for Peggy Ornstein's book, Girls and Sex, published in 2016, she put it, my whole life, this high school senior put it, my whole life is an attempt to figure out what, in the core of myself, I actually like versus what I want to hear from other people, or wanting to look a certain way and get attention. And part of me feels cheated out of my own well-being because of that. Hearing that from a high school senior is very sad. And it just shows us we need to look into this. What are motivating women? Even young women like this young woman are sharing that they are doing actions that they aren't finding fulfilling, and they're trying to figure out what is actually coming from me versus what's coming from others and influencing us. We owe it to ourselves to ask these questions because there are a lot of reasons to believe it's not women's deepest desires unleashed that have led us to the hookup culture. Researchers on hookup trends have found that both a majority of men and women are motivated to engage in hookups, but often desire a more romantic relationship. And those same researchers concluded hookups, although increasingly socially acceptable, may leave more strings than public discourse would suggest. Now, that simply covers how hookups aren't delivering what many people hope for, maybe a more substantial relationship. But there's a lot of voices coming out of the woodwork that are suggesting that hookup sex is actually leading women down a path towards sexual assault. Not every hookup is a sexual assault, as we learned from the Aziz Ansari story, but there are many women's voices saying participating in the hookup culture actually prepared me to fall into trends, to not see red flags, to lower my inhibitions repeatedly to the point where later I didn't notice when people were crossing huge boundaries. So one such woman, I'm going to read a little bit from her story because I think it's very important for us to put a human face on these scenarios. We often are talking about the stats of assault, but we aren't often hearing the woman's story, and often the women are not coming forward with their names on it. One woman who wrote it verily about this, who did give her name, is Madeline Parsons, and she shared her beautiful story, and she shared it beautifully. It's a very sad story, but she wrote it very honestly, and I'll just quote her here. For me, the 1 in 5 assault stat is plausible in large part due to the environment of casual sex. In this article, it was saying, what is the true stat? Often we hear, is it really 1 in 5 people assaulted in some capacity, unwanted advances? She, in this article, was saying she's not sure if that stat's accurate, but let me tell you what it feels like on campus. And she said it feels plausible in large part because of an environment she experienced. She said, often drunken casual sex, prevalent on today's campuses. It's that lifestyle built around the alluring idea that freedom comes from enjoying sex outside the confines of a committed relationship. It is a culture most of us were surrounded by in college. And if you are at all familiar with the throes of dating in your adult life, it is still very much prevalent. The hookup life is a lifestyle that I definitely engaged in during my college years, Madeline wrote, alongside many of my friends. For some people, it seemed to work. It gave them the freedom to explore their sexuality and understand themselves better. For many of my friends, however, it always seemed to leave an aftertaste of guilt and regret, waiting by the phone, hoping the guy would end up being interested, hoping he didn't just use you for sex. The tables never really seemed to turn. It was a broken record, the same story over and over. Madeline Parsons continues, casual sex left me feeling empty and regretful. I was left more insecure and unsure of myself each time. I wanted it to work. I wanted to be the strong, independent feminist woman who could own her sexuality and do whatever she wanted. I wanted to be unaffected by the men I hooked up with, but that never happened for me, and after I was raped, my sexual activity came to a screeching halt. After that night, I felt as if I had lost a part of myself, she writes. I felt ashamed that something so intimate had been used to hurt me. I felt disappointed for not defending myself. I felt mad at society for making me feel like I was asking for it because I had consensually entered his room. I felt confused as to whether it was my fault, even though I had clearly said no multiple times, so clearly past a certain boundary of consent in this instance. Most of all, I felt I could no longer engage that side of myself, and to be honest, I no longer wanted to. And here's where she really gets to, I think, a real powerful point. That night took a lot away from me. But it was much earlier that I had lost my control and ownership of my sexuality. The minute I let the hookup culture convince me that I was there to please men and give them what they wanted in order to feel good about myself, I gave up all my power over my sexuality. And that's the real powerful paragraph, I think, where she shows the connection between the hookup culture and what led to her rape. And she said she is giving up what she wanted for herself to be pleasing to others. And so, you know, what is rape? It is when a woman doesn't she says no to something. Well, in these cases, in the hookup culture, we see all over the place this gray area of women going along with something that they don't actually necessarily want, and then how that can diminish and wear down her sense of self-possession over time. Another writer, Verily, shared their story as well. And this was Alice Owens, and she said, let me quote her, this is two people, and I know that there are many more voices, and of course, if you encounter anyone on your campuses who wants to share their voices, Verily is always looking for them, for anonymous or with your name. Of course, we editors know the names, so we aren't making stuff up, and there are no reports, there are no claims against people being made, but these are just having cultural conversations. Another woman said she found on campus disturbing trends that she found to be conducive to unhealthy views of sexuality, especially for women. She said, like a frog in slowly heating water, my sense of self-possession in sexual encounters had been dying over a period of time. By the time my rape happened, my radar was gone. I could hardly distinguish it from any other sexual encounter I had on campus, much less report it as rape. And I think that story is another just example of how it just reminds us how many women out there are experiencing uncomfortable encounters that get them used to experiencing uncomfortable encounters. And once they actually have an exploitative situation, it's hard for them to identify it. This writer, let's see if there's anything else to share. She said over time she grew to have distorted thinking about sex, thinking to go along with these things was good, to think that if she was simply present, she was a participant and not just someone being played. So I think this is a good point to start looking at what are some of these things, what are some of these root problems that are leading women to think this is okay behavior? What are some of the scripts that are encouraging men to think that this is attractive behavior? And of course, I'm going to get to the role of porn in all of this, because it is a big educational tool today. In fact, it's the largest sex educator, no doubt, globally. Unfortunately, it's pumping out horrible content that is filling people's heads as young as 11, 10, younger, with horrible perspectives on sex. It's very dangerous. So today, though, we have to acknowledge we live in a world where a majority of men and a growing number of women regularly consume online pornography, much of which depicts sexual encounters as aggressive, swiftly escalating, and primarily geared toward male pleasure. If you want to keep a man today, many women gather, give them what they want. Porn has only added to the sense of competition women face. Either your boyfriend is going to look at porn or he's going to look at you, Jennifer Lawrence told Vanity Fair after her photo leak scandal of 2014. Unfortunately for many women today, their boyfriends look at both. Another Me Too assault headline within the last year offers insight into this factor that connects the hookup culture and assault behavior once again. And this is about Louis C.K. Louis C.K. started using pornography at 12 years old, which he has admitted to in his stand-up routines. And he's done it every day since. And what makes his behavior, it makes it fall squarely in what the research tells us about frequent porn use. Routine pornography consumption influences how a person perceives the people and things that surround them. Women in porn, for instance, appear to desire sexual activity no matter the setting, public or private place, workplace or home, painful scenario, or romantic one. In fact, the fewer the boundaries, the more titillating it is for viewers. We know any content we consume influences us in some way, whether we like it or not. Otherwise, the entire advertising industry wouldn't exist. But it turns out experiencing the sexual arousal and climax during the consumption of such imagery makes an even greater impression on our brains. So, people like Louis C.K., people who consume porn over and over, they don't automatically become, Louis C.K. did become someone who crossed boundaries and had sexual misconduct. Not everybody does, but listen to what Norman Doidge says about porn and what it does to our brains. It's creating problematic scenarios where I would submit a lot of men today are seeing invitations to sexual scenarios where there are none. And that's clearly what happened with Louis C.K., who said he misread signals from women, and the woman said, I did not give you any signals. Well, the signals were in there in great part because he's been consuming this imagery that gives him signals that a woman who looks completely normal might be inviting him to an encounter. As Norman Doidge recounted in his book, The Brain That Changes Itself, in the mid to late 90s, when the internet was taking off, he started to see firsthand how internet porn was affecting his patients' lives and relationships. Typically, Doidge wrote, when I was treating one of these men for some other problem, he would report almost as an aside and with telling discomfort that he found himself spending more and more time on the internet looking at porn and masturbating. He might try to ease his discomfort by asserting that everybody did it. Doidge noticed another trend. These men also reported greater difficulty being aroused with their real-life partners. They increasingly had to rely on recalling porn fantasies rather than being in touch with their senses in the moment to get aroused with their wives or girlfriends. Doidge ultimately concluded that internet porn has created addictive responses in many consumers today. He says it develops new maps in their brains, and based on the photos and videos they see, it just draws connections. He says it's a use it or lose it brain, and we develop a map area. We long to see it activated. Since neurons that fire together wire together, these men who consume a lot of porn got massive amounts of practice wiring these images into the pleasure centers of the brain with the attention, with their attention on this, and they imagine these images went away from their computers even while with other people. And it gives a spritz of dopamine, the reward neurotransmitter that consolidated those connections made during those sessions. And that is why it's really a powerful thing when men consume this repeatedly. Now it's not all hope is lost. There are a lot of resources for men who've experienced this today, thankfully. And I've written about them, but that's a real problem. And it has brought us to where we are today in many ways. Studies have since revealed how porn modifies people's views of sexually exploitative situations. A 2011 study for the University of Oklahoma found that upon hearing a description of a rape, college students who recently watched porn were less likely than those who had not watched porn to call the incident a rape. The more exposure they had to coercive scenarios in video form, it seemed, the more likely they were to consider it normal in daily life, in real life. In 2016, a study from the University of Amsterdam showed that more permissive sexual attitudes and aggression resulted from porn use. So none of this is too surprising, but it is telling that research is happening. This isn't conjecture. We're seeing aggressive behaviors seen as normal, and so when we're actually seeing it play out on campuses and in real women's lives, it isn't too much of a surprise. There's scripts coming from someplace. Another survey study found that boys' perpetration of sexual coercion and abuse was significantly associated with regular viewing of online pornography, and that showed an actual connection between what they watched and their sexual behavior. And perhaps it's because of things like this that recently Nepal banned online pornography. They're having a sexual violence crisis. In the United States, we have states like Florida and Virginia, many states actually, have approved anti-pornography resolutions, calling it something that leads to individual and societal harm, including hypersexualization of teenagers, normalization of violence and abuse. And these are real advances. One associate professor of psychology from the University of Bloomington commented that the majority of scientists familiar with the research would agree there's clear enough evidence of harm in terms of compulsive use and socialization towards attitudes and behaviors that most people perceive as antisocial and that produce harmful effects. So this is all very grim, but it is painting the picture of where we are today. In addition, Peggy Orenstein surveyed, this isn't just affecting boys, this is affecting young women as well. She found that teen trends of young girls, over 40% of children ages 10 to 17 have been exposed to porn online, and girls are being more likely to participate in inappropriate behavior when they've done so. Behavior like sexting. And that, unfortunately, often those are exploitative situations for young girls and pressured situations. We know that in some studies, excessive porn use in adolescence correlates with poor academic performance, poor memory performance, low psychological well-being, and excessive sexual interest. Of course, we aren't surprised to hear this is all correlation, but when it's no surprise that there's a link between watching objectifying material and viewing women as sex objects, and causation becomes more plausible when you realize that the study that showed 2010 study that showed pornographic videos that found physical violence against women is shown in 88% of scenes, almost 90%, and the verbal violence in almost half. Clearly, if we are consuming this content, we're not helping out the sexual assault carbon footprint that we're trying to reduce. It's putting a bunch of bad messaging out there. Girls, according to Peggy Orenstein, girls are twice as likely than boys to be among those who are pressured, coerced, blackmailed, or threatened into sexting. And this is just, again, threatened, coerced. This is getting us toward what these coercive situations that could be assault. New York Times columnist Ross Douthat proposed, let's ban porn. The belief that it should be not restricted is a mistake. The belief that it cannot be censored is a superstition, he writes. That we cannot imagine such censorship is a part of our larger inability to imagine any escape from the online world's immersive power, even as we harbor growing doubts about its influence upon our psyches. Douthat admits online porn will probably always exist somewhere in the internet, but enacting restrictions will make it harder to find, will dramatically reduce its role, its cultural normacy, its power over libidos everywhere, end quote. And as people like Gail Dines, who wrote the book Pornland and runs Culture Reframed, as people like she know, porn is changing sex. Men today are struggling to be aroused by real women and having ED before the age of 40 at unprecedented numbers. The costs to children of pornography are great as well. Children are stumbling upon porn and becoming daily consumers as young as 10. Ernie Allen, the former president of the National Center on Missing and Exploited Children, described the problem of porn for kids as a crisis that is misunderstood, under-recognized, and underappreciated. For the age for first-time users has declined dramatically, he says, and the content has changed. Most kids access porn on their mobile phones, and unfortunately, they're starting at the worst kind of content that other grown men have created the algorithms over time or have fed into. The kind of content that people are stumbling upon is actually what longtime users have escalated to the point of. So it's very problematic. Considering the swiftness with which our culture has exhibited these sexual atrocities and sexual assault, we should be concerned. For instance, many parents who dismiss their porn as similar to their dad's Playboy magazines, children today often encounter far more explicit content. Author of Big Porn Inc., Melinda Tankard-Reist, insists, we won't be able to make any dent in our war against women unless we address porn as our most prominent sexual educator. Children today are pressured into sexting, and 88% of those who do have their photos shared with unintended recipients, which just throws girls into terror. Adolescent girls have told Tankard-Reist that they've come to think that they have no choice but to provide sex to boys if they want to do a simple activity like see a movie with him. Male kindness is so alien to us, one young woman said. We assume it's seduction every time. The National Center on Sexual Exploitation's Haley Halverson cited that 1 in 5 people believe it's normal for a boy to pressure a girl into sex. It would appear that many of this generation's children are not only facing sexual exploitation, they are losing faith that there exists any such thing as a human relationship of integrity. As Marianne Layden, psychotherapist and director for sexual trauma and psychopathology program at University of Pennsylvania, she said that 30 to 35 studies show porn is connected to sexual violence. She quotes, "Men are not born rapists. You have to teach them. Let's stop teaching them." The research on what porn does to our brains and consumers supports this theory. And our culture hasn't even scratched the surface of understanding how much aggression and coercion happens on the porn set in production in real time. And that's a different topic you can look up. I've written on it in the past, but a lot of trafficking happens in porn. A lot of abuse happens in porn. Many people say that it's actually happening on set. So, could it be possible that the sexual content in our media may not reflect women's empowerment and freedom so much as its opposite? There's reasonable doubt, at the very least. I would submit, if you stand for the Me Too movement, there's little defense for the hookup culture, for porn, for blurring all of these lines. If you stand for the Me Too movement, there's little defense there's no defense for where women are trafficked and abused in the production of porn. And there's no defense for men and women being sold these scripts in porn to view people as objects for others' pleasure. If we stand for the Me Too movement, there's no defense for objectifying media, which perpetuates the thinking that women are walking solicitations for sex, which is often pressured. We've even heard the stories in the past year from women in the Me Too movement coming forward to describe, like Salma Hayek, how they were pressured into situations to depict something exploitative on screen. That is in the media we're consuming, as it was in her film that Frida, that Harvey Weinstein was directing or producing. We see it when Mila Kunis said she will not dress provocatively for a photo shoot of a magazine cover, and she had been yelled at that she'll be over, her career will be over if she says no to that. And clearly that didn't happen. But women are being pressured even in the media. So a bunch of the stuff we're consuming, thinking it's free, freely chosen behavior, is not. And that should concern us. That just shows us how the Me Too, mainly we've been talking about it with the entertainment culture, people from Louis C.K. to Harvey Weinstein, also people in entertainment. But we're consuming all that entertainment, and it's influencing us. We should be concerned about how much it has affected us. In the Atlantic, after the Aziz Ansari story, Caitlin Flanagan described how, as a woman over 50, she could hardly fathom the hookup behavior in young people today. She said it sounded like science fiction. And many other commentators have echoed that it's hard to imagine a woman putting up with such treatment. But what those of previous generations may be missing is a full awareness of what was once the exception of inappropriate behavior of some men is now, like the person who wants to go all the way on the first date in the days of past would be surprising. It's now become a staple ingredient of media millennials have grown up consuming. It's not only depicted more positively in today's TV shows and movies and porn, it's depicted more frequently. And once again, Peggy Orenstein, the Girls and Sex author, she documented this. She said the average teenager is exposed to nearly 14,000 references to sex each year on television, and young women who consume more objectifying media report more willingness to engage in sexualized behavior, such as a wet t-shirt contest, and to find those activities empowering. Perhaps we underestimate the power of seeing images on repeat and the effect it'll have on viewers. For about 20 years, every sitcom on television has presupposed a hookup culture. Even in Jane the Virgin, which began with the premise of a young woman who chose not to have sex, the hookup culture was the backdrop, making the story's main character intriguing. Further, nearly all romantic comedies today, from No Strings Attached to Love and Other Drugs to Trainwreck, they portray women finding love in this setting. It's fair to say today's young women go into these situations not because they enjoy them, but because they want to find love, and everything around them is suggesting that casual sexual encounters are the ticket. Somewhere along the way, today's young women have embraced this distorted perspective of sexuality, young women and men. And it seems that we have not gained much except a skill to mask our authentic feelings and play along with the fantasy, none of which helps real intimacy or communication between the sexes. The young woman Grace, who shared her article in Babe about Aziz Ansari, said, "You guys are all the same." Perhaps like her, most young women today are continuing to participate in the hookup culture in the hopes that one man among the rest will be different. According to Grace, she stayed in Aziz's apartment past the point of discomfort because she thought things were going to turn for the better. Maybe he'd finally slow down and read her body language and change his behavior. If this is the playing field you're born into and media keeps depicting stories like these with positive outcomes, it's no wonder many young women try to continue to hope that one day they'll find a lasting relationship that'll make all the bad, demeaning sexual encounters worth it. But sadly, research shows that the greater number of premarital sexual partners one has, the less marital satisfaction they report later. And so this is where what we get to, this gets us to the meat of the issue, which is that the Me Too movement which is trying to stop assault. It's bringing attention to assault. It's so important that we do that. But we need to feel more comfortable speaking out about exploitative situations and injuries coming from the hookup culture, things that don't necessarily cross the legal boundary of consent. Consent may have been given on an instance, but it is not actually delivering results for women. It is not actually delivering satisfaction that women, is delivering sex regret. And I would submit that this is, it's not quite crossed consent. We could call it crossing a certain level, like a yellow light consent. We could call it, it's not a red light, but it's a yellow light. And should we be concerned about this? We should be. Men are clearly growing in concern about it because they don't want to be accused, like Aziz Ansari, of rape. They don't want to deal with a reputation fallout of an accusation where they thought it was a consensual sexual encounter. And like I said, both sides of the coin have problems here. We have men consuming porn that makes them think that there's more interest in women sometimes consuming it as well, but either way being brought up with a lifetime of objectifying imagery that's telling them that they want to please men and that they should go along with these scripts. But what actually happens when there's need for improvement in both parties? There's need for both men and women to make adjustments if we want to improve. Because what we're ending up with is something that's like a poor investment consent. If you think about it, it's women in those situations thinking this is going to lead somewhere better, but it actually is leading nowhere better in many cases. And what we have is this happening over and over. Consent is clearly not enough to avoid injury. It is clear that it's not enough for a meaningful relationship in terms of simply getting a yes in an encounter. It's not enough to spare women today and men today from sex regret. It's not enough to spare men and women today from a broken heart. And when it comes to the hookup culture, there may be more broken hearts than broken laws, but that's not quite a good thing. Just because not every hookup is a sexual assault, but if it's producing a lot of broken hearts and injuries, emotional injuries, and difficulty in relationships in the future, this is a problem. In the justice system, most sexual assaults are reported by facts and can be held up to facts. Fake accusations are rare, but they do exist. But the fact that men are starting to be worried about them gives men a taste of what women have suffered a long time, fearing assault in all range of normal experiences. What's happening on both sides now is fear all over the place. It's not good for men and women. The Aziz Ansari encounter had fear for him, fear for her. Both didn't serve either party. Grace had an impression of Aziz Ansari from the rom-coms that she watched, from his own comedy that he produced. She had an impression of him, but she didn't know him. And Aziz Ansari arguably probably had an impression of her from maybe the porn that he consumed. He had an impression of women who come to his apartment and what that'll lead to. Both had impressions of each other, but neither knew each other. They had the wrong impressions, and it clearly didn't produce anything good. And there's a lot of emotional damage that comes from people in scenarios like this all over college campuses, and in young adult, post-college life. There's a lot of emotional damage that comes from people treating others like they're someone they're not, or like they're not even a person, like they're an object. But if we're at least even starting from like someone they're not, someone in their head that person actually isn't. They're in situations that they're consenting to something, but it's actually not delivering. Even if they're consenting, like Grace did, to sex with someone, or to a sexual encounter with someone she thought he was, but it wasn't him. And that's where we can really see how consent is limited. As a recent article in the New York Times showed, I consented to a sexual encounter, but not to ghosting, she wrote, very, very provocatively, very well put. We aren't consenting to the whole picture. If we don't have the whole picture, if we don't know the full person, we cannot be making a full statement of consent. Or it is not a fully healthy relationship. It's something based on anything meaningful. I would like to state, it's very important in a talk like this to mention, no woman is ever responsible for her sexual assault. No victim, male or female. You can go back and see red flags and learn from them, but you can't blame yourself for assault. We have nothing to gain from blaming victims. Like, how did you see this coming? It's like saying, how didn't you know you'd be mugged? Or that your identity would be stolen. Nobody plans to be exploited. Nobody expects that. And it's actually an unhealthy way to live, to go around expecting that kind of behavior. And nobody ever deserves sexual harm, ever. I've experienced this a bit working, covering the topic of porn. When women are assaulted on camera, or young women go into this amateur industry and say, I'm told this is the script, I'm going along with this, and then something changes on camera, people say, well, she did decide to get into porn production, so no, those Me Too ladies, poor things, nobody's listening to their voices. And this is where we have to start being more attentive to, the reality that no, sexual violence is never acceptable. Whether or not someone's on a porn set, whether or not somebody's in a frat party. And that is why it's never the victim's fault, is never an appropriate response to anything. And I think it's really, at this point, hookups gone wrong are happening so frequently on campuses and to freshmen every year, fresh new group of people who are not hardened yet, and they aren't expecting it, and they aren't prepared for necessarily every scenario that they're going to come in and something's a coordinated situation. It's like a casting couch. It's like a rotating group of fresh people who are, and same with the porn industry. and I've covered this in amateur porn. Women come in and then they're spit back out, and a whole new group come in. And why does this keep happening? I think it's because we aren't talking about it as much. And we have done a great job this year in talking about sexual assault in the Me Too movement. We can continue. But we need to start talking more about the inappropriate advances we get, or about the unsatisfactory hookups people are experiencing, and their sex regret. Talk about it more loudly. Don't be embarrassed, because we need to start getting more attention to this. This is exactly, by nobody speaking up about it, is how it continues to happen over and over, with the next group of people lining up, with the next group of people falling into the traps and having broken hearts. What we see in the hookup culture is a very filtered picture. We see these like positive endings in movies. We don't see the actual heartbreak it caused people. We could use more of it. We don't see hookups with the loneliness and the ghosting afterwards. We're just starting to hear these stories, but we need it to keep going. We don't have a place where people can discuss this, but we need to. Ultimately, we need to discuss our dissatisfaction more openly and let our pain, our generation's pain that is immense and huge, be the gain of a future generation, be something that other young women and men can learn from, so they don't fall into these same habits. Because it is a scam. It is a bait and switch. Young women and men today are going in with expectations that's not being delivered. The real life women today are not delivering on male fantasies of porn that they have been conditioned to expect when they consume a lot. And the men today are not following through on the rom-com scripts that women have received over years, and think that'll come from sexual encounters, that something lovely will come and lasting will come. And neither of those have been happening. And it really is a scam. It really is a poor investment kind of incent, where those things are not being delivered. And so that is why, that is where the connection is. We need to break out of the bubble of that thinking. We need to break out and start opening opening our hearts and sharing our stories, and make a new movement in addition to Me Too, to share the real heartbreak, the real drawbacks, the real injuries that we're experiencing simply from the hookup culture, to avoid others experiencing that same pain. Thank you.